All right, cool. Guess we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to first day of the Missouri Department of Higher Education Workforce Development Bridges to Success, the Equity Week webinar series. I'm Jerron Vale, Research Analyst, Proprietary School Certification Division. Going to handle some kind of housekeeping things, and then we'll get on into our presentation. All attendees have been muted upon entry, so please do not unmute yourself. This presentation was pre-recorded. The panelists will be available after the presentation for any questions. We're going to do a short question and answer session. Please use the chat function to ask questions. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing someone I think is really awesome, our Commissioner, Zora Mulligan. Zora Mulligan has served as Missouri's Commissioner of Higher Education since August 2016. During her time as Commissioner, Ms. Mulligan and her team have partnered with colleges and universities around the state to substantially improve transfer for Missouri students, increase graduation rates by offering alternatives to remedial coursework, and implement new rules that give public colleges and universities greater ability to meet statewide and regional workforce needs. In 2018, Ms. Mulligan and Missouri's Director of Economic Development co-led Talent for Tomorrow, an initiative that built a statewide coalition of corporate executives, educators, community leaders, legislators, and members of the executive branch to develop and advocate for a comprehensive suite of proposals to address workforce needs. Those proposals, which included restructuring state government to bring the agencies responsible for post-secondary education, workforce development, and economic research together, funding for public colleges and universities to develop and expand academic programs that lead to jobs in high demand occupations, and a full tuition grant program for adults were featured in Governor Mike Parson's 2019 State of the State address and adopted by the General Assembly during the 2019 legislative session. Ms. Mulligan is a native of West Plains, Missouri, and a graduate of Drury College and the University of Kansas. She previously served as Chief of Staff to the University of Missouri System President, Executive Director of the Missouri Community College Association, and Assistant Attorney General. She lives in Jefferson City with her daughter, Anna Lee. And with that, I will take it from there. Ms. Mulligan, thank you for being with us.
Very good. Hey, John, will you give me a thumbs up to let me know you can hear me?
You got it.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here, everybody, today. I can't help but look back at last year's Equity Summit and just feel kind of sad about having to do it online this year. The energy last year was so tremendous and so positive, and our team was so energized by interactions with many who are on the webinar today that I'm glad that we're doing something online, and I'm looking forward to a meaningful conversation. But I've got to say, I really miss seeing your faces. I just want to start by commending the team that put this year's report together. As a department, we've understood the importance of disaggregated data for a long time, but it's really only been in recent years that we have developed the muscle that we need to actually do that work, to really get to the point of pulling apart state level trends and figure out what's happening with different groups. And so, the progress that Eric Anderson and his team have made is really remarkable, and I just want to thank them for their work. Also want to support our comms team, which provides tremendous support to all of our equity work and has done a really nice job working on this event as well as putting the report itself together. So I'm not going to spoil the conclusions from the report that Sam Beesjack and Eric Anderson are going to share with us later this morning, but I did just want to give you, kind of a perspective of what the department is doing overall in terms of equity. If you've ever read any Stephen Covey, you've heard his rule, which is first seek to understand. That's something that I take very seriously, and it's definitely reflected in a lot of the work that our department is doing. So just developing a more sophisticated and complex understanding of what's happening with different groups. So we've got the events that are happening this week. We've got a series of monthly webinars that if you're not already engaged in, I really encourage you to. We're doing a lot of staff training internally. All of our staff have been trained on implicit bias and psychological safety. We're also really focusing with the leadership team on helping them understand how to, look at policies that already exist and how to develop policies in the future with equity in mind. So we have what I think is a first in the nation partnership between our national association, which is the State Higher Education Executive Officers, and the K-12 National Association, which is the chief something school officers of the country. So our two national organizations are helping us with this joint leadership team, leadership training, which we're really excited about. But the reality is we work in state government. We're not a think tank. And so we have to move from understanding to action. And that has to happen even as we're still learning. In state government and what you do as higher education leaders has the ability to impact lives for generations to come. And what we don't do has just as significant an impact. And if we don't feel the weight of that responsibility every day, then we're doing our jobs wrong. And so, some of the concrete steps that we're taking that we've implemented since the end of our conversation last fall, we're working with DESE, which is our state's K-12 organization, to expand Grow Your Own programs to have more diverse pipelines of teachers throughout the state. We're building out networks of equity advocates around the state. We've invested in broadband in partnership with MOCAN. At the state level, we've also, we're administering about $10 million worth of funds to expand remote learning capabilities because we understand the strong possibility that different groups of Missourians are going to be differently impacted by the COVID crisis. And that's in part because they have differences in access to quality remote learning experiences. We also, have been including consideration of equity issues in financial decisions. All of the 120 million plus dollars that we're administering with the CARES Act has been distributed on formulas that include Pell Grant eligibility, and so that's a good transition. And that's a good segue to my introduction of a very special guest. So Governor Mike Parson, the person who's ultimately responsible for the decisions about how the state has invested its CARES Act money, Governor Parson is going to be kicking off our event today. He's a familiar face to many in this meeting. He's been in elected office for longer than some of you have been alive, if I had to guess. And he's been a real partner to our agency and others throughout state government since he took office in June of 2017. Sorry. He's prioritized workforce development and infrastructure. His perspective on that is unique among governors. A lot of governors tend to say that workforce development is only community college training or that it's only, more advanced PhD level training. Governor Parson has taken a very comprehensive perspective on what workforce development needs to look like. And I think that's been to the benefit of the state. My favorite Mike Parson story is, when he took office, it was under unusual circumstances, and a lot of the department directors that I work with had been appointed by Governor Parson's predecessor and had very close, connections with that governor. And so a lot of people were nervous when Governor Parson came in about, am I going to be able to keep my job? And am I going to be able to continue doing the work that I started under this previous administration? And so the governor called all of the department directors together for a very informal meeting where he said, as long as you love the people of Missouri, we're going to get along just fine. And I thought that was a really perfect way for a new administration to begin its relationship with different departments of state government and with the state as a whole. So with no further ado, thank you again for being here today. And I'll now turn it over to Governor Mike Parson.
Hi, I'm Governor Mike Parson, and I am pleased to welcome you to the opening of the Bridges to Success Equity webinar series. Today's webinar marks the beginning of Equity Week, where educators, advocates, and thought leaders from across the state will address equity issues in Missouri higher education. A college degree or certificate provides individuals with the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in today's ever-changing workforce. But more must be done to give all students the opportunity and support they need to go to college. That's why I'm proud of the work the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development is doing to help make college more equitable for all Missourians. Through events like Equity Week and critical research reports, we're bringing to light a number of places where we can improve as a state. As governor, nothing makes me happier than to hear the success stories from my fellow Missourians, along with the grit and determination Missourians are famous for. I hope you will learn a lot from the Bridges to Success series and use that knowledge to make a positive impact on our future. It is an honor and privilege to be the 57th Governor of the state of Missouri. May God bless you, and thank you for having me here.
Equity in educational attainment has become a state imperative to meet our goal for all Missourians to be educated for success. The Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development's big goal is for 60% of working-age adults to hold a high-quality post-secondary certificate or degree by the year 2025, and it commits the state to reducing inequities in higher education by raising completion rates by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, and disability by 50% by the year 2025. To draw awareness of these inequities and support for solutions to address them, the department published its first Equity in Missouri Higher Education report in 2019 with its focus on access and success. The department also convened its first Equity Hackathon and Summit, drawing thought leaders from Missouri and across the country to propose solutions to disparities in admissions, retention, and employment. As a direct result of the recommendations from the hackathon, the Missouri Departments of Elementary and Secondary Education, along with the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development, have partnered to develop the Missouri Equitable Access, Success, and Engagement Framework, with a goal to plan, oversee, and ensure implementation of equity initiatives across all levels of education as a regional approach throughout the state. The department's staff has collaborated with public and private higher education institutions and community organizations from across the state with a common goal of making higher education more equitable for all Missourians. Our next phase of work is a webinar and white paper series called Bridges to Success. The goal is to discuss gaps caused by systemic barriers and the new threat of COVID-19, as well as to provide best practices and approaches to addressing those inequities. The webinars are Missouri-specific, and the white papers provide the national context. We've come a long way in this past year, and with your continued support and collaboration, we will transform education to be an equitable and valuable experience for all Missourians.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Equity Week 2020. We're glad that you're here joining us today. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm the Director of Innovation and Performance in the Office of Post-Secondary Policy for the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. And I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague, Sam Bajak, who's a research analyst with our office. Today, we're going to be presenting on the findings of the second phase in our Equity in Missouri Higher Education report series. Last year, the inaugural report we put out looked at access to and progress through public post-secondary education in Missouri. And this year's report will focus on post-secondary success or completions and workforce outcomes. Next year's report, which we're already starting on, will focus on affordability. I want to say special thanks to Commissioner Zora Mulligan, who recognized the importance of equity in achieving the department's vision. Every Missourian empowered with the skill and education needed for success. Additionally, I want to give thanks to our Assistant Commissioner, Dr. Mara Woody, for her patience with us during the drafting, writing, and editing portions of the report. And to our colleagues, Angelette, Sarah, and Alicia, as well as Laura, Jerron, Leslie, Samantha, and Josh. We also want to thank members of the Equity Planning Committee for the feedback and direction they've given to us, and to Dr. Jude Chiore, who was instrumental in helping us outline and draft the Equity Report series. Finally, thank you to all of you who are listening in today. As I mentioned, the department has recognized that it is vitally important to serve all populations equitably if we wish to meet our completions goal of 60% of Missourians with a quality post-secondary degree by 2025, and to fulfill our departmental vision. However, this is more than just part of a completions agenda. We consider it a moral imperative as well. We find this moral imperative within the Missouri Constitution Bill of Rights. This is something that has really stuck out to us as we've been working through our reports on equity and looking at data and coming up with strategies to address these opportunity gaps. What I find is especially telling about Article 1, Section 2 of the Bill of Rights is it lays out the role of state government, right? It says that it's intended to promote the general welfare of the people, that all persons are created equal and entitled to equal rights and opportunities under the law. And what I think is really key here is, that when a government does not confer this security, it fails in its chief design. So we know that this is built into our Constitution, it's built into state government. We have an imperative, moral and civic, to make sure that equitable access to post-secondary education is for all of our Missouri students. In looking at this approach to equity, we're using what's called the groundwater metaphor, right? If you're walking around a lake and you notice one dead fish, you may think that there's something wrong with that fish. Maybe it was old, maybe a predator got it, maybe something happened to it that caused it to die. But if you're walking along a lake and you see lots of dead fish belly up, you may get the feeling that maybe there's something larger going on. Maybe there's something going on in the water itself that's causing these fish to die at disproportionate rates. And that's what we've considered as we've looked through the data on equitable outcomes in post-secondary education. Is there something else going on? Are there systemic issues that our students are facing that may lead to these disproportionate outcomes? And what could those be? So the data is really the first step in doing this. Identifying these gaps, we're calling, a lot of people call them equity gaps or opportunity gaps. And then once we've defined these patterns, look at the groundwater itself and see, okay, what's causing these things to happen? And as we're going about this work, we often get the question, well, what is equity? What does that mean exactly? And equity for us is the idea that a student's life circumstances should not dictate chances of success. As you can see here, it's measured by observing areas where it does not exist. So if there are gaps between different populations, we can see that there are issues that need to be addressed. And these differences in outcomes are known as opportunity gaps, as I mentioned before. There are a lot of different graphics that represent the difference between equality versus equity. None of them are perfect. I think any of them, if you extend the metaphor or analogy too far, fall apart. But as a simple representation, equality would be everybody having the same size bicycle, regardless of actual size or ability. Equity is giving everybody what they need to be successful. So you see in that second panel, each bike is a different size, and there's one that specifically meets the need of our individual who is in a wheelchair, right? So that roughly is the difference between equality versus equity. Equality is everybody gets the same. Equity, they get what they need to be successful. And that's a key difference that we need to keep in mind. So when we were looking at the report and we're putting together the data for the report, we wanted to look at different types of demographic characteristics to see what gaps existed around the state. So the ones that we looked at for this report and last year's report are race, ethnicity. We looked at sex. We looked at income levels, parental income levels. We looked at parental education levels, and we looked at geographic origin, rural and urban. With race, ethnicity, we tried to match the American Community Survey definitions that the U.S. Census Bureau puts out every year with the data that we have on hand. The ACS data has Hispanic individuals in a separate category aside from race, and we did that as well. Looking at parental income and education levels, we pulled from our state financial aid data systems, so we could look at what those would be. And when we looked at urban versus rural, we used the Merrick geographic regions, or county designations rather, of which there are 14 counties that are considered quote unquote urban. And those would be by population density for each county. So those 14 are Boone, Buchanan, Cass, Clay, Cole, Greene, Jackson, Jasper, Jefferson, Newton, Platte, St. Charles, St. Louis, and St. Louis City. We understand this isn't a perfect way to look at rural versus urban. There are quite a number of areas in Boone County, for example, what we consider Columbia an urban area, but there are quite a few of actual rural areas in Boone County. We weren't able to dig down with that level of specificity in this report or last year's report, but we're hoping to do that later. So when we talk about rural urban, we're talking about the county of origin of the student. And while they may be from a rural region within an urban county, we can't make that distinction with our data. And we also looked at, in addition to the characteristics that identified previously, we looked at some key metrics that we thought were important in determining what post-secondary success and workforce outcomes might look like. So we looked at post-secondary attainment around the state. We looked at overall completions. We looked at cohort graduation rates, credit accumulation, program of study and degree type, transfer cohorts, and post-completion or workforce outcomes. I do want to mention there is a difference between post-secondary attainment and overall completions. When we say post-secondary attainment, that largely comes from the census data, the American Community Survey data. And that refers to anyone in Missouri holding a post-secondary credential, such as a certificate or degree at any given time. Those credentials may have been earned from any institution, in state or out of state, public or private, regardless of when it happened. Completions refer to students earning a post-secondary credential in a particular academic year at one of Missouri's public post-secondary institutions. So while attainment refers to anybody in the state that holds any sort of credential, regardless of where or when they earned it, completions are limited to specific academic years. And in this case, only public post-secondary institutions. Those are the institutions for which we have more data. We have some limited data on the private or independent institutions, but not enough to really dig into. In future years, we're hoping to be able to look at private and independent institutions a little more clearly, but for now, we're only looking at the publics. And with that, I will pass it off to Sam.
Thank you, Eric. So this next section of the presentation is going to address attainment, and like Eric already mentioned, this is different from completions in that this is a much broader metric captured by the ACS that captures all levels of attainment for all Missourians, regardless of where the credential was attained, whether it was obtained in state or out of state, regardless of institution as well. So when looking at the overall attainment rates for the state, we can see that the percentage of working age Missourians, which we're defining as being between the ages of 25 and 64, with a certificate or above, have increased over the past several years from 48.9% in 2011 to 53.7% in 2018, according to the American Community Survey one-year estimates, which is an encouraging finding. However, when we break out the attainment rates on lines of race and ethnicity, the picture becomes a lot more complicated. And this graph shows a less encouraging finding than what we were observing when looking at attainment rates by age. The dotted line on this chart represents the aggregated data, and it's clear when analyzing it that Black and Hispanic Missourians are having attainment rates that are lesser than their white and Asian peers. However, it does appear when looking at the 2017 and 2018 figures that progress is being made. but the gaps don't appear to be closing, at least not as of this data. When it comes to attainment by gender, there's little disparity between males and females. Females have credential attainment at slightly higher rates than men, but that's generally consistent with the overall population of degree seekers. And as you can see based on the graph, it's a rather small difference. When it comes to the attainment of higher education credentials by geographic region, the data show that there are clear disparities between rural and urban Missourians, which is designated by the county classification. Eric went over how we delineate between rural and urban earlier in the presentation. But it's clear that as you move into post-secondary credentials, there becomes a pretty clear gap between rural Missourians and urban Missourians in that regard. And when analyzing attainment by income level, it appears that very little has changed over the last several years. By looking at the data, it seems pretty clear that income level appears to be a barrier to credential attainment, as Missourians that are below 200% of the poverty line attain credentials at much lower rates than Missourians above 200% of the poverty line. And the degree to which that gap exists has hardly to 2018. And now we'll be moving into post-secondary completions and disaggregating the findings along the aforementioned demographic lines. Again, this is limited to those that completed a credential within the state, just our public institutions, so our public 2-year and 4-year institutions, the data that we were able to get from those. So we're transitioning from findings from ACS to our own MSAS student records. When looking at undergraduate completions, we've seen dips in enrollment since the Great Recession and economic recovery, but enrollments are much more responsive to economic trends than completions, which are usually delayed when it comes to accounting for time to completion. And we can see, looking from 2009 to 2018, that there is a slight bump, at least in terms of certificates and associate degrees, that occur around 2014 to 2015. Completions overall have increased by 28%, regardless of degree type. However, the increases aren't even for all populations. When analyzing modern students, a diverse group of students that we've designated that includes students that are of working age from 25 to 64, those working while attending school, and other situations that are different from the traditional college experience, the data shows a very clear disparity in terms of completions. These students are much more likely to get degrees from 2-year schools than 4-year schools, and that is a gap that does not appear to be closing over the time period analyzed. Similar underrepresentation can be observed when looking at the completion rates for Pell-eligible students and first-generation students along the lines of selectivity. Missouri has 4 categories of selectivity for its public institutions, which are open enrollment, moderately selective, selective, and highly selective. And the data shows as selectivity level increases, the representation of Pell-eligible and first-generation students decreases. While this gap appears to be slowly closing when looking at Pell-eligible students, the gaps in completion don't appear to be closing when analyzing the completion rates of first-generation students along lines of selectivity. Next, we're going to look at the completion rates for Black Missourians, again, along lines of selectivity. And while there has been progress made here, there's still more progress that needs to be made. While Black Missourians have become more represented among degree completions at Missouri's moderately selective and selective institutions, they are still underrepresented at the highly selective institutions, which mirrors the trends that we saw in the enrollment data. It's worth noting that our 2 highly selective institutions in the state are both very specialized in terms of field, one being much more liberal arts oriented and the other being very STEM oriented. But those disparities will show themselves again as we move later on into the presentation and get through the disparities and completions by degree type. And with that, I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Eric for cohort graduation rates.
Thanks, Sam. Next, we look at cohort graduation rates. This is a fairly standard metric used at the federal and state levels, and it looks at the number of first-time degree-seeking students who begin full-time during a fall semester to see how many graduate within a certain amount of time. Usually, those are on-time graduation rates, which means 2 years for associate degree programs and 4 years for baccalaureate degree programs, or within 150% of time, which would be 3 years for an associate's degree and 6 years for a baccalaureate degree. There are, of course, limitations with this metric because it does not include students who transfer in, those who return after an absence, or even those who start in the winter or spring semester. And it does not adequately capture part-time students or those who ease into their first fall semester by taking less than a full-time course load. Even still, because this is a very standard metric, we decided to include it. As you can see, when looking at on-time graduation rates for traditional age and adult students, we see that the rates are fairly close to the 2-year sector between the two age groups. But it's fairly even with variation from year to year. We also see that even with that variation, there is an upward trend for the on-time graduation at the 2-year institutions. At the 4-year institutions, it's a different story. We see a fairly sizable gap in 2008 for those who started in fall 2008, and it's also quite widens by the time it gets to the fall 2014 cohort. So that indicates to us that there may be some work that needs to be done in understanding why adult students are not succeeding at the same rates as their younger counterparts at the 4 years. And the gap between the two is incredibly high. When disaggregating data by race, we find that the cohort graduation rates are generally increasing for all racial and ethnic groups. They're generally on an upward trend from where they started for the fall 2008 cohort. Though gaps do appear between the subpopulations and are sometimes more severe by sector. The gap between Black and white students has increased over time at the 2-year sector, while Black students are nearly 4 times less likely to graduate on time, though the gap is narrowing between white and Hispanic students. What we have here in these charts are the graduation rates within 150% of time at the 2-year and 4-year sectors. We can see that the gap is narrowing between the populations somewhat, at least it's more narrow than it was for the 2008 cohort. But Black and Hispanic students are still less likely to graduate on time compared to other populations, as we can see in these graphs. So again, as we noticed with the adult students, there's still some work to do by these gaps. Black and Hispanic students are less likely to graduate on time. It may be that they're pursuing their degree part-time status. It may be other factors that we need to determine. But there's further work and research to be done here. So in this report, we've analyzed traditional completion metrics, overall completions, cohort graduation rates, disaggregated by demographic characteristics. We also felt it was important to consider credit accumulation of graduates to look at differences by demographic categories. We've noticed some extreme variations year to year for groups and degree levels, but overall there are only a few differences for populations analyzed for associate and baccalaureate degrees. We also thought this was an important metric because an increase in credits to completion results in higher tuition costs, especially because most institutions charge by the credit hour, as well as increased housing costs and the opportunity cost of foregone wages. As a note, because certificates are relatively small, albeit growing percentage of total undergraduate completions, and because there's such variation in the types and length to completion, ranging from less than a semester in length to a few years, we only looked at associate and baccalaureate degrees. for this metric. The biggest disparities for the number of credit hours earned toward an associate degree appear in the age categories. While the median credit hour has gone down over time for both age groups, as you can see in the chart. Working age adults, again 25 to 64, earn nearly 10 more credits, 10 more credit hours than their traditional age peers. There's virtually no difference when we looked at urban and rural students or between males or females. As with associate degrees, the largest disparity for baccalaureate attainment, or baccalaureate completion rather, appears between traditional age students and working age students. From academic year 2008-2009 to academic year 2018-19, older students earn at least 10 more credits than their younger peers, much like they did with the associate degree. When earning a baccalaureate degree, low-income students are at a disadvantage to their higher income peers. So when we refer to low-income students, we're referring to those who come from a parental, whose parental income levels are 200% of the poverty level or below. We see that a vast majority of students earn more credits than the state recommended 120 credit hour minimum. As an illustration, the median credit hour accumulation statewide over the past 10 years is 135 credit hours. This is about 15 additional credits, or what would be for a full-time student, their course load over one semester. We found that this gap holds true across all demographic categories with some slight variation and ranges from between 12 and 23 credit hours. While this is burdensome for all students, the additional cost associated with these extra hours has disproportionately affected low-income students as compared to their higher income peers.
So for this next section, we're going to be looking at completions by program of study. And when we're analyzing program of study, we break them out into broad categories that we refer to as metamajors, which we will show on the next slide. The 7 broad metamajors that we break out programs of study and degree programs into are arts and humanities, business and communications, education, health professions, social sciences, STEM, and trades. The most noteworthy finding when analyzing the completions data by metamajor along the lines of race is that Black Missourians are very underrepresented in the STEM and education degree programs across the state, and this is a finding that mirrors what we saw when looking at the enrollment data as well. Some of the other findings when looking at metamajor data are that adult students make up over half of all completions when it comes to health professions and trades, but they only make up roughly 1 in 3 total completions, so they're overrepresented in those fields. Adult learners are much more likely to earn a certificate or associate degree rather than a baccalaureate degree. And in terms of gender disparities, men are overrepresented in STEM programs, while women tend to be overrepresented in education and health professions programs. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Eric to talk about transfer cohorts.
Thanks, Sam. As we mentioned earlier, one of the inherent weaknesses with the traditional cohort graduation rate is it doesn't take into account transfer students, those who start at one institution and transfer to another, or those who even transfer into that institution. So we wanted to look at transfer cohorts across Missouri's public post-secondary institutions. So similar to what we did with graduation cohorts, we looked at students when they entered an institution, when they transferred to an institution, and then looked at how many of them completed their degree within 3 years of transferring. So what we noticed when looking at these students was there's a fairly sizable gap between age groups and between low-income students and high-income students. And this gap between the traditional age students and adult students is widening over time. So, both groups are transferring, but age students are completing their degree within 3 years after transferring at much higher rates than adult students, and that is only continuing to widen over time. We've also noticed a fairly sizable gap between Black and white students, right? So white students and Black students transfer, but they're not completing within 3 years at the same rates, which we find problematic. Again, more research is needed to understand why these things are occurring. This is simply the first step in identifying those opportunity gaps. We still have a long way to go in really understanding what's causing those. So after looking at academic outcomes, what's happening with students graduating, the overall numbers, the graduation rates, credit accumulation, what types of programs and degrees the different subpopulations of students are earning, and transfer cohort rates, we decided to shift our focus to post-completion outcomes or workforce outcomes. So once our students graduate from public institutions in Missouri, what do their outcomes look like post-graduation? So what we've seen overall is that the employment rate of all recent graduates within 1 year of completion, regardless of credential, has declined slightly since academic year 2008-2009, from 78% to 75.5% for the most recent group of graduates for which we have information, which is the 2017-2018 graduates. Employment rates within Missouri dipped for graduates from the 2010-2011 through 2012-2013 years, but they've increased and stayed consistent since academic year 2013-14. The median earnings for graduates within the first year have climbed steadily from around $19,000 annually to just over $26,000 in 2018. These statewide trends hold up when disaggregated by key demographic characteristics, but are not even across the board. In terms of race and ethnicity, for example, employment rates have decreased slightly over the past 10 years, and median wages have risen, but this increase in earnings has been drastically uneven. The median earnings for Black graduates has increased by 17.8% to about $23,000 for the most recent group of graduates, but it's increased at a much higher rate, 38.5% for white graduates. In fact, the annual median earnings for white graduates is nearly $3,500 greater than those for Black graduates. So there's a lot of progress being made. Looking at our data and looking at this chart, we see that broken out by demographics, each group is earning higher than they were in 2009. However, there are still huge gaps between the different groups. When looking at workforce outcomes based on parental income levels, there's some interesting trends that appear. We saw that students from higher parental income levels actually have a lower employment rate within 1 year of graduation, while lower income students were more likely to be employed. But when looking at wages, a different picture emerge. Students at the poverty level earned only 65% of the wages that those who had higher income parents did in 2009 rather. For graduates in 2018, the median wages for those from higher income levels was about $7,000 greater than those at the poverty level, and $4,000 greater than those at or below 200% of the poverty level. So we see that students who come from a higher income background actually tend to earn more once they graduate from high school, while those who come from a lower parental income level actually earn less. There's much work that needs to be done there too to understand why that is. It may be because of the type of degree they're choosing. It may be other options as well. When we look at these income levels, we're only looking at those who have gone straight into employment and not those who are working part-time and going to school part-time. So this excludes any students who are choosing to further their education, either those who completed an associate degree and are continuing on to a baccalaureate degree, or those who continued a baccalaureate degree or completed a baccalaureate degree and are continuing on to earn a master's degree. So these are only those who are working, excluding anyone who may be continuing their education.
So, with all that being said, what comes next for us as people in the higher education industry who want to work to help fix a lot of these issues, close these gaps, and continue on the discussion in regards to these gaps? As much as possible, we want to actively shift our language from a deficit-based framework into an asset-based framework. And these are terms that we as a department have only recently been introduced to and have been considering how we want to recontextualize our work when talking about equity and equity gaps, away from the deficit language that we realize that we have been using a lot of the time. So that is work we're constantly learning. We're trying to figure out what the best way is to discuss these issues in a way that will actively lead to change. So that is one of the top priorities for us as a department, is to shift our thinking from that deficit mindset to an asset mindset. We want to continue to use our data to identify where these opportunity gaps exist as we actively reframe how we talk about them, which will lead to considering what policies, procedures, and practices may be contributing to these gaps, and how can we as a department work to ameliorate those gaps. The Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development is undertaking an internal audit of departmental policies to this end, as we have our own biases that we need to unpack in ways that affect our work that we aren't even consciously aware of. Case in point, the active reframing from deficit to asset. And we as a department are still learning how to best frame and talk about these issues. We're learning and we're trying to do better.
As Sam mentioned, we really want to take a look at more of an asset-based approach than a deficit framework. And so we really work as anti-framework. So instead of saying, what's wrong with these students that's causing these gaps, we instead want to look at the policies that may be hindering certain populations of students. So the anti-deficit framework works to change both the language used and the mindset surrounding achievement gaps. In our case, in higher education. Examples of deficit language can be things that we've used throughout this presentation, right? X population of students are less likely to graduate compared to Y group. As Sam mentioned, we are learning and growing and figuring out how best to frame issues of inequities, how to change our thinking and language around it. And this process has been a masterclass in what we need to do to still do that. But using deficit language, it can influence our expectations for certain groups of students. If we're saying that, well, adult students are graduating on time less than traditional age students, or we see that students from low income backgrounds or Black and Hispanic students are earning less than their peers, that tends to influence the way that we think about those students, and that it lowers our expectations for them, which is something that we should not be doing in trying to address these equity gaps. So again, instead of looking at these disparities and thinking, why is this population underrepresented? The question needs to switch to what ways can these populations be lifted up, or what are some policies or practices or procedures that may be contributing towards these gaps that we're seeing in our data, which is part of the reason why the department's taking its own internal audit to see what we might be doing to contribute to some of these gaps at state level policy. But again, this is a learning process as we come to understand more about equity gaps and frameworks that we can use to help shift the conversation we think we can really make a big difference around the state. Make sure that all of our students and all Missourians get the equitable treatment that they need to be successful. We know that not everyone is born in equal circumstances, but we certainly know that the role of state government, especially in public higher education, is to make sure that all students do have the opportunity to succeed, and it is our role to do that. With that, that's the end of our presentation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email either Sam or myself. Our email addresses are here. And I believe we are taking questions after this. So thank you so much for all your time.
Okay, thank you all for sticking with us. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We'll try to alleviate those issues during post-production. Hopefully we can do that before we put it on our website, but we'll work on doing that after the presentation is completed. Thank you to Eric and Sam for the great information. Really thank you all for sticking with us through all the difficulties. Really appreciate that. I do not see any questions in the chat at the moment. Oh, actually, hang on one second. I do see one. The question is understanding issues associated with cultural consciousness bias. Consciousness bias, implicit bias inherent in policies, practice, programs, and procedures to contribute to the gaps in data is crucial to addressing. Appreciate the anti-deficit framework perspective. So that was a comment that was posted. Really appreciate that from Missouri State University, H. West Pratt. Really appreciate that. I don't see any other comments or questions, so I guess we'll end it here. I thank you all again for joining us. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, and please join us tomorrow at noon, where we'll have another session. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you.